David Rahman had been driving the same taxi routes through Washington, D.C. for 4 years, invisible to the politicians and diplomats who climbed into his back seat. But when three men in expensive suits got in at Reagan National Airport, speaking Arabic, about the package arriving Tuesday, David's blood ran cold. As a former CIA intelligence analyst who spoke 7 languages, he understood every word. And what they were planning would kill thousands. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous people are hiding in the most ordinary places. David Rahman hadn't always been a taxi driver. For 12 years, he'd been one of the CIA's most valuable intelligence analysts, specializing in Middle Eastern communications and terrorist network analysis. His fluency in Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, Turkish, Hebrew, French, and English made him invaluable for intercepting and decoding communications that others couldn't understand. He'd helped prevent dozens of attacks, tracked terrorist financing networks across 3 continents, and built profiles that led to the capture of high-value targets. His colleagues called him the translator because he could hear context and meaning that went far beyond simple language conversion. Then came the Karachi operation. David had identified a major terrorist cell planning simultaneous attacks across 5 European cities. His intelligence was solid, his analysis perfect, his recommendations clear. But when the CIA acted on his information, they discovered the cell had been tipped off. The terrorists had vanished, and worse, they'd relocated to softer targets and carried out attacks that killed 127 people in London and Paris. Internal investigation revealed a mole in the agency. Someone had leaked David's reports to the very terrorists he'd been tracking. The witch hunt that followed destroyed careers, shattered trust, and created paranoia throughout the intelligence community. David wasn't suspected of being the mole, but his work had been compromised. Every source he'd developed was potentially blown. Every analysis he'd produced was suspect. His 12 years of expertise became a liability overnight. "We can't use you in operational analysis anymore," his supervisor had explained apologetically. "Too much exposure, too much risk. We can offer you a desk job in administration, or—" David had chosen or. He'd immigrated to the United States from Pakistan 20 years earlier, becoming a citizen and dedicating his life to protecting his adopted country. When that country's intelligence service no longer trusted his work, he found himself adrift for the first time in decades. The taxi license seemed like a temporary solution, a way to earn money while he figured out his next move. That was 4 years ago. Driving a taxi in Washington, D.C., had unexpected advantages for someone with David's background. Politicians, lobbyists, foreign diplomats, and government contractors all needed transportation, and they all assumed their driver didn't speak their language or understand their conversations. David had learned to play the role perfectly. Broken English when convenient, confused expressions when passengers spoke in what they thought were foreign languages he couldn't understand, the demeanor of a simple immigrant, just trying to make a living. In reality, he understood everything. Over 4 years, he'd overheard classified briefings, diplomatic negotiations, corruption schemes, and political conspiracies. He'd kept mental notes of it all, telling himself it was just professional habit, not active intelligence gathering. His Arabic had gotten rusty from disuse, but muscle memory kicked in the moment those 3 men started talking. "The package arrives Tuesday," the man in the middle seat said in Arabic. "Confirmation from our contact at the port." "Security review?" asked the man by the window. "Minimal. They're expecting medical supplies. The documentation is perfect." David kept his expression neutral, his driving steady, even as his mind raced. Medical supplies could mean anything, but the way they spoke, operational language, careful phrasing, suggested something far more dangerous. "The target?" the third man asked. "Wednesday morning. Maximum crowd, maximum impact. The senator's security won't expect anything from that angle." David's hands tightened on the steering wheel. A senator, maximum crowd. This wasn't small-scale terrorism. This was an assassination plot that would likely involve civilian casualties. He had to make a choice: stay invisible and hope someone else would stop whatever was coming, or risk everything he'd built to prevent an attack. The memory of those 127 victims in London and Paris made the decision for him. David couldn't go to the CIA. His former colleagues might listen, but they'd also ask uncomfortable questions about how a taxi driver had gained access to this information. Worse, if there was still a mole in the agency, he'd be signing his own death warrant. Instead, he did what he'd always done best. He analyzed. Over the next 48 hours, David used his intimate knowledge of D.C. to piece together the plot. He drove extra shifts, lingering near government buildings, hotels and restaurants, where his passengers might appear again. He monitored police scanners, watched news reports, and paid attention to which senators had public events scheduled for Wednesday. The breakthrough came Tuesday evening, when he picked up a fare outside a warehouse in southeast D.C. The passenger was nervous, sweating despite the cool weather, and kept checking his phone. When David glanced in the rearview mirror, he recognized the face from airport surveillance footage he'd memorized years earlier: Khalil Nazir, a known associate of terrorist financiers. Nazir spoke on his phone in Arabic throughout the ride, assuming his driver couldn't understand. "The device is ready," he said. "Remote detonation, timer backup. Tomorrow morning when the senator leaves her hotel. Senator Catherine Morrison." David knew her schedule because she was in the news. A major foreign policy speech at the Brookings Institution Wednesday morning, then a public appearance at a veterans hospital. High profile, heavy security, but also surrounded by civilians. The plan was becoming clear: bomb the senator's route, maximize casualties, create terror in the heart of the capital. David had less than 12 hours to stop it. David could have called in an anonymous tip, but that would mean trusting others to take him seriously and act quickly enough. He could have tried to contact Senator Morrison's security detail, but without proof, he'd likely be dismissed as a crank caller. Instead, David Rahman made a decision that drew on every skill he'd learned in 12 years of intelligence work. He was going to infiltrate the plot himself, using contacts from his CIA days, people who owed him favors and would ask minimal questions. David acquired surveillance equipment and weapons, not officially, not through channels, but through the gray market networks that existed around any major intelligence hub. Wednesday morning, David positioned himself along Senator Morrison's route from her hotel to the Brookings Institution. He'd analyzed the traffic patterns, identified the most likely placement for an explosive device, and calculated the optimal position for surveillance. At 8:30 a.m., he spotted them. Two of the men from his taxi, positioned on opposite sides of the street, near a construction zone that would provide cover for a bombing. A third man, not one he'd seen before, was working on what appeared to be routine road maintenance. David parked his taxi 3 blocks away and approached on foot, his CIA training taking over. Surveillance, threat assessment, tactical planning, skills he'd thought he'd never use again. The maintenance worker was placing the device, a sophisticated bomb, disguised as utility equipment, positioned to detonate when the senator's motorcade passed. The timer was already active. David had minutes to act. David approached the fake maintenance worker with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. Years of undercover work had taught him that confidence could get you past almost any security measure. "Excuse me," he said in accented English, playing his taxi driver role perfectly. "I need to move my taxi for pickup. Police said okay here?" The bomber looked up, annoyed by the interruption. In Arabic, he muttered something about stupid immigrants not understanding restricted areas. "Oh, you speak Arabic?" David responded enthusiastically in the same language, switching to the dialect he'd identified from Monday's conversation. "I'm from Lahore originally, but I learned Arabic in Riyadh." The bomber's expression changed immediately. Suspicion, then recognition. David's face from some old intelligence file, some briefing, some target list. "Who are you?" the bomber demanded. "David Rahman," David replied calmly. "Former CIA, current taxi driver, and the person who's going to stop you from killing a senator and 50 innocent people." The bomber reached for a weapon, but David was faster. 12 years of agency training and 4 years of D.C. street experience had kept him sharp. He disabled the terrorist with a precision strike that left him unconscious but alive for interrogation. The bomb was more sophisticated than David had expected. Military grade, with multiple detonation methods and tamper protection. But he'd seen similar devices during his intelligence career, and he had the skills to disarm it. With 2 minutes remaining on the timer, David cut the right wires in the right sequence, his hands steady despite the circumstances. The device went silent just as he heard the distant sound of police sirens. Someone had called in the altercation. Senator Morrison's motorcade was rerouted while bomb disposal experts secured the device. The unconscious terrorist was taken into custody, and his 2 accomplices were arrested attempting to flee the scene. David found himself in FBI custody, being interrogated by agents who couldn't quite believe that a taxi driver had single-handedly disrupted a major terrorist plot. David Rahman, the lead agent read from his file, 12 years CIA intelligence analyst, resigned 4 years ago after the Karachi operation compromise, currently employed as a taxi driver? "Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight," David replied. The investigation that followed revealed a network larger than anyone had imagined. The bomb plot was just one part of a coordinated attack that would have targeted multiple government officials. David's intervention had prevented not just one assassination, but potentially dozens of casualties. The terrorists had been operating in D.C. for months, using legitimate businesses as cover while planning their attack. They'd chosen their targets based on public schedules, using the city's open democracy against itself. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed that their taxi driver was just another invisible immigrant, not a trained intelligence professional who understood every word they said. The CIA offered David his old job back with a promotion and complete operational clearance. The FBI offered him a position in counterterrorism. The Secret Service wanted him for dignitary protection. David turned them all down. "I appreciate the offers," he told the assembled officials during his debriefing, "but I've found my calling driving a taxi." The agents looked confused. "You want to go back to driving a taxi? After this? Where else can I hear what foreign diplomats really think about American policy?" David smiled. "Where else can I monitor visiting business leaders, foreign students, embassy staff, and international contractors? You're all thinking about this backwards. I didn't stop being an intelligence asset when I started driving a taxi. I became a better one." The officials exchanged glances. Someone was beginning to understand. "The city is full of people who think their drivers don't understand them," David continued. "Terrorists, spies, criminals, corrupt politicians, they all need transportation, and they all make the same assumption, that their driver is invisible." 6 months later, David Rahman officially became the CIA's first deep-cover taxi driver, a unique position that didn't exist in any government manual, but provided intelligence that proved invaluable to national security. David continued driving his taxi through Washington, D.C., but now his routes were coordinated with intelligence priorities. He picked up specific passengers, lingered at certain locations, and reported conversations that helped prevent attacks, exposed corruption, and provided insights into foreign government operations. His taxi became a mobile surveillance platform, his broken English a perfect cover for advanced linguistic skills, his immigrant status an explanation for why he worked such long hours in such sensitive locations. The terrorists who'd planned to kill Senator Morrison had been part of a larger network with cells in 5 countries. Information David gathered during subsequent taxi rides helped authorities roll up the entire organization. "You know what's funny?" David told his CIA handler during one of their rare face-to-face meetings. "I tried to leave this life behind. I wanted to be ordinary, invisible, safe. But it turns out that being invisible is the most valuable skill an intelligence officer can have." 2 years after the bombing plot, David Rahman received the CIA's Intelligence Star in a classified ceremony attended by officials he couldn't name from agencies he couldn't discuss. The citation simply read, "For exceptional service in preventing terrorist attacks against the United States." But the real recognition came from an unexpected source. Senator Catherine Morrison herself, who'd insisted on meeting the man who'd saved her life. "Mr. Rahman," she said, during their private meeting, "I understand you've been offered numerous positions in government. Why do you choose to stay with taxi driving?" David smiled, thinking of all the conversations he'd overheard that week, all the intelligence he'd gathered, all the threats he'd helped identify. "Senator, most people think power comes from being seen, from being important, from having a title and an office. But real power comes from being underestimated. When people think you're invisible, they tell you everything." Senator Morrison nodded slowly. "And what do they tell you?" "Enough to keep this country safe, one ride at a time." 3 months later, Congress quietly approved funding for a new intelligence program, Urban Asset Integration. The budget line was buried in transportation appropriations, and the details were classified at the highest levels. But across Washington, D.C., a network of taxi drivers, food delivery workers, janitors, and service employees began providing intelligence that transformed national security operations. David Rahman had proven that sometimes the most effective spies aren't the ones with secret gadgets and dangerous missions. Sometimes they're the ones driving you home from the airport, listening to everything you say, and understanding every word in languages you don't even know they speak. The taxi meter keeps running, the radio stays tuned to dispatch, and the man behind the wheel continues to be invisible to passengers, who never realize they're talking to one of the most effective intelligence assets in American history. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., terrorists, foreign agents, and criminals continue to make the same fatal mistake, assuming their driver can't understand them. They're wrong. They're all wrong. And that's exactly what keeps America safe, one taxi ride at a time. If this story amazed you, remember that heroes come in all forms and from all backgrounds. The person driving your taxi, delivering your food, or cleaning your office might have skills and experiences that could change the world. Have you ever been underestimated because of your job or background? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might be inspired by your hidden talents. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. And remember, never underestimate the quiet person who's simply doing their job. They might be doing much more than you realize.